I spoke into the silence because I was sure no one was listening. And that certainty lasted exactly 1 second right until something answered me back. Not from a room or a hallway, but from the silence itself. And in that moment I realized the quiet had never been empty. It had been waiting. The silence in the house that night wasn't ordinary silence. It wasn't the kind that settles naturally when the world goes to sleep. It was thicker than air, dense and deliberate, pressing against my ears until I became uncomfortably aware of every small sound my body made. The soft rise and fall of my breath, the faint thud of my heartbeat, the subtle rustle of my clothes when I shifted my weight. And I remember standing there in the dark hallway thinking that the quiet felt wrong, like it had weight, like it was being held in place rather than simply existing. And maybe that's why I spoke, not to start a conversation, not because I expected a response, but because humans have a deep, instinctive discomfort with silence that feels too complete. And so the words slipped out of me without planning, barely louder than a whisper, something careless and insignificant. Guess it's just me here. And the moment I said it, every instinct in my body screamed that I had made a mistake, because the silence didn't behave the way silence should. It didn't fade or scatter or absorb my voice. It tightened, pulled inward, as if my words had given it a center. And for a heartbeat, I stood frozen, waiting for the echo of my own voice to bounce back off the walls. But what returned wasn't an echo. It was slower, deeper, shaped differently, carrying intent rather than sound. And my stomach dropped as the space around me seemed to respond, not with noise, but with awareness, like the house itself had acknowledged me. And panic crept in quietly, the kind that starts as disbelief, because the mind will cling to logic, even when logic is clearly failing. And I told myself it was the old structure of the house, the way sound can warp in narrow halls and empty rooms. Even as my skin prickled and the hairs on my arms lifted, reacting to something I couldn't explain. And when I shifted my foot backward, the floor groaned beneath me, not randomly, not naturally, but with a timing that felt deliberate, like punctuation at the end of an unspoken sentence. And that was when I noticed something else that sent a chill through me. The house didn't feel abandoned. It felt attentive, like it had been aware of my presence long before I became aware of it. And as I stood there, heart racing, the shadows along the walls seemed deeper than they should have been, pooling in corners, stretching subtly toward the center of the room. And the longer I stayed silent, the stronger the sensation became that the silence was waiting for me to speak again, like it had learned something from my first words and wanted more. And memories surfaced without warning, moments from my life when I had spoken into emptiness before, whispered thoughts late at night, quiet confessions made when I believed I was alone. And a horrifying realization began to form, that this wasn't the first time something had been listening. It was simply the first time it had decided to answer. And when I finally whispered again, my voice shaking despite my effort to stay calm, the response came instantly, closer than before. Not as a word, but as a presence that wrapped around my awareness, pressing in from every direction. And I understood then with terrifying clarity that the silence in that house was not the absence of sound. It was the presence of something patient, something intelligent, something that had been waiting for a voice to give it permission to speak back. After the silence answered me, I realized the most frightening part wasn't to the sound itself, but the way the house seemed to wait afterward, as if my reaction mattered, as if whatever had responded was measuring me, learning how much fear I could tolerate before breaking. And I stood there in the dark hallway, muscles tense, afraid that even breathing too loudly might provoke another reply. Yet the longer I remained silent, the stronger the sensation grew that I was being watched from everywhere at once, not by eyes but by attention. And when I finally forced myself to move, inching forward toward the living room, the air shifted with me, adjusting, accommodating, like the space was rearranging itself around my presence, and I began to notice patterns where none should exist. The faint hum of the house's wiring rising and falling in slow intervals that matched my breathing. The shadows along the walls, deepening when my thoughts drifted toward fear and easing when I tried to calm myself. And I told myself I was imagining it, that stress and darkness were playing tricks on my mind, even as a part of me understood with cold certainty that imagination alone could not explain how precisely the house seemed to react, and that certainty hardened into terror when I tested it, whispering a single word into the air, something meaningless, just to see what would happen, and the response came immediately, a low vibration traveling through the floor and up my legs, stopping just below my chest, like a hand resting there. And the sensation carried meaning without language, a confirmation that it had heard me, that it was listening. And from that moment on, I understood that the silence wasn't passive. It was interactive, and every sound I made fed it information. And the house seemed to prefer certain kinds of sound, not loud noises or sudden movements, but words, especially uncertain ones, questions, confessions, statements left unfinished. And when I muttered, "This isn't real," the vibration sharpened, pressing inward. And I realized too late that denial wasn't protection here. It was provocation, because the silence responded not to what I said, but to what I felt when I said it. And as panic crept higher, I made the mistake of raising my voice, demanding to know what it wanted. And the house answered in the only way it could, by tightening the space around me. The walls seeming closer, the ceiling lower, the darkness thicker, until the pressure became unbearable, and instinctively I fell quiet, my mouth snapping shut as fear flooded through me. And the moment I stopped speaking, the pressure eased, not disappearing, but retreating just enough to let me breathe. And that's when the pattern became clear. The silence reacted to my voice, but it also punished me for using it the wrong way. And as I stood there trembling, I began to understand that this wasn't a haunting in the way people imagine. It wasn't a ghost or a memory replaying itself. It was a presence that existed in the absence of sound, something that grew stronger the more attention it received, and the longer I stayed, the more deliberate its responses became, as if it were learning how to communicate within the limits of my perception, shaping its reactions into something closer to conversation. And the realization settled over me like ice, that if I wanted to survive the night, I would have to learn the rules of the silence before it decided to teach them to me itself. The first rule of the silence revealed itself slowly, not through words, but through consequence, because every time I tested it, every time I let even a fragment of sound escape my mouth without intention, the house reacted. And the reactions grew less subtle, more corrective, like warnings escalating toward punishment. And I learned quickly that whispers were tolerated while statements were not. Questions were safer than declarations, and confessions, spoken or even half-formed in my mind, drew the strongest response of all. And once I noticed that pattern, fear sharpened into a different kind of terror, the kind that comes with understanding, because understanding meant responsibility, and responsibility meant that any mistake would be mine. And as I moved through the house, careful to control my breathing, careful to keep my thoughts neutral, I became aware of how deeply the silence was embedded into the structure itself, how it clung to the corners of rooms and pooled beneath furniture, how it thickened in doorways like it was marking thresholds. And I realized that the house didn't simply contain the silence, it was shaped by it, remodeled over time to better accommodate whatever lived within it. And when I reached the kitchen, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The clock on the wall had stopped, not frozen mid-tick, but paused between seconds, as if time itself hesitated here, and the refrigerator hummed softly, its sound stretching unnaturally, bending in pitch until it matched the low vibration I had begun to associate with the silence as attention. And without thinking, I whispered an apology, and immediately regretted it, because the air pressed inward, tighter than before, the vibration climbing higher in my chest. And I understood then that apologies were admissions, and admissions were invitations, and the silence wanted those most of all, and memories surfaced unbidden. Moments of guilt I had buried, words I had never said out loud, truths I had only ever acknowledged in the quiet of my own thoughts. And I felt the presence lean closer, not physically, but psychologically, like pressure behind the eyes, urging those memories forward. And I realized with a sickening certainty that the silence didn't just hear sound. It heard intent. It heard what I was holding back. And the more I resisted, the heavier it became, until my knees buckled and I had to grip the counter to stay upright. And in that moment of weakness, a sound escaped me, a soft, involuntary sob. And the reaction was immediate and overwhelming, the house groaning in response, every surface resonating as if struck by an invisible force. And for a terrifying second, I thought the structure itself would collapse inward on me. But instead, the pressure shifted, redirected, flowing toward the hallway behind me, and I understood that the silence wasn't trying to destroy the house. It was trying to move me, heard me, guide me somewhere specific. And as I followed fear pounding in my ears, I became painfully aware that this was no longer a test of survival, but of compliance. And whatever waited at the end of that hallway had been waiting far longer than I had been alive. The hallway narrowed the farther I went, not physically in a way I could measure, but perceptually, like my field of vision was being compressed, the walls closing in just enough to make every step feel intrusive. And the silence followed me there, thickening behind me, cutting off retreat. And I realized with a surge of dread that I wasn't being guided towards something so much as away from everything else, funneled into a place where resistance would be impossible. And as I reached the end of the hall, the door waiting there felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate, older than the rest of the house. Its surface scarred with shallow marks that looked less like damage and more like repeated attempts to open it from the inside. And when I hesitated, the pressure returned, urging, insisting, and I understood that hesitation itself counted as defiance. And with shaking hands, I turned the knob, expecting resistance, but the door opened effortlessly, silently, revealing a small room that swallowed sound completely. And the moment I stepped inside, the silence intensified to a near physical force, pressing against my skin, my ears ringing as if deprived of air. And I realized with horror that this room wasn't just quiet. It was insulated from sound entirely, as if the concept itself had been stripped away. And in the center of the room sat a chair facing the wall. And I knew, without being told, that the silence wanted me there, wanted me still, wanted me facing away from the door. And when I obeyed, lowering myself into the chair, the pressure eased just enough to allow me to breathe. And that was when I felt it for the first time, not as sound or vibration, but as proximity, something standing directly behind me, close enough that I could sense its outline without seeing it, and panic surged, my instinct screaming at me to turn around. But the moment I shifted, even slightly, the silence tightened painfully around my skull, and I froze, understanding too late that some things could be acknowledged but not confronted. And as I sat there, rigid with fear, memories began to surface again, not randomly this time, but in a deliberate sequence. Moments where I had spoken into emptiness in my life, late-night conversations with no one, thoughts whispered into dark rooms, private confessions made under the illusion of solitude. And with each memory, the presence behind me seemed to grow more defined, heavier, and I realized the terrible truth that the silence wasn't learning my voice tonight. It already knew it. It had been listening for years, waiting for a place where it could finally answer without interruption. And the house, I understood, wasn't cursed. It was prepared, designed as a vessel for something that could only exist where silence was absolute. And as that understanding settled in, the presence leaned closer, and for the first time, it spoke not through vibration or pressure, but through thought, pressing a single, unmistakable message into my mind. You have always spoken to me. The realization that it had always been listening broke something inside me, because it rewrote every quiet moment of my life into evidence, every whispered thought into a confession I never meant to give. And as I sat frozen in that chair, the presence behind me no longer felt curious or patient. It felt possessive, like something that had waited too long to be ignored again. And the silence thickened until even my thoughts felt muffled, as if they too could be overheard. And when I tried to focus on breathing, to anchor myself in something physical, the presence responded by leaning close enough that I could feel a cold pressure against the back of my neck. And a thought that wasn't mine formed in my head, slow and deliberate, telling me that silence is not the absence of sound, but the space that waits for it. And in that space, it had grown, feeding on unspoken truths, regrets swallowed instead of voiced, fears buried instead of faced. And I understood then what it wanted from me. Not my voice exactly, but my surrender. My acceptance that it had a right to listen, that my silence belonged to it as much as my words did. And when I resisted, when I tried to reject that idea, the pressure returned violently, driving my head forward until my forehead nearly touched the wall. And the presence pressed its will into me, showing me flashes of others who had sat in that chair before. People from different times, different lives, all drawn here by the same mistake of speaking into what they thought was emptiness. And I saw how some had tried to fight, had screamed until their voices gave out, and how the silence had taken those voices, absorbed them, leaving behind bodies that could no longer speak even in life. And others who had given in, who had learned to listen instead, to become vessels rather than victims. And the message became clear. Survival required transformation, and as that truth settled in, the presence offered me a choice, not in words but in sensation, the pressure easing just enough to allow me to speak if I dared. And I realized that this was the moment everything hinged on, that whatever I said next would define what I became. And with terror clawing at my chest, I chose my words carefully, not pleading, not denying, but acknowledging. And the instant I did, the silence wrapped around me not as a threat, but as an embrace, cold and suffocating, and I felt something inside me shift, something loosening, something opening, as if a door had been unlocked that could never be closed again. And the presence withdrew slightly, satisfied, leaving me alone in the chair with the echo of its intent lingering in my mind. And I understood with horrifying clarity that I had not escaped the silence. I had been claimed by it. I don't remember standing up from the chair, only the sensation of movement without effort, like the house itself decided when I was done sitting there. And when I found myself back in the hallway, the silence felt different. Not heavier or lighter, but familiar, intimate, like a presence that no longer needed to announce itself. And that terrified me more than the earlier pressure ever had. Because fear requires distance, and whatever lived in the quiet no longer kept its distance from me. And as I walked through the house, I noticed changes that were subtle enough to doubt, but consistent enough to confirm. My footsteps barely made a sound. My breathing seemed muted, swallowed before it could echo. And when I passed a mirror in the living room, I paused, unsettled by the way my reflection lagged just slightly behind my movements, as if it needed time to remember how to behave. And when I whispered my own name to test it, the sound never reached my ears. Not because it was answered, but because it was absorbed. And I realized with a creeping sense of dread that the silence no longer reacted to me because it no longer needed to. It had learned me completely. And the house responded accordingly. Doors opening without creaking, floors yielding without complaint. Every sound soft into nothing. And that was when the thought occurred to me that I could leave, that nothing physically blocked the exit, and yet the idea of stepping outside felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate, like trying to walk out of my own shadow. And when I reached the front door and placed my hand on the handle, the silence pressed inward just enough to remind me that leaving wasn't forbidden, it was simply unnecessary. And I understood then that the house was no longer a trap, it was a boundary. A place where the silence could exist fully, and by choosing acknowledgement earlier, I had become part of that boundary, a living extension of its awareness. And as that understanding settled in, memories from my life outside the house began to feel distant, flattened, like stories I had heard rather than lived. While the quiet around me felt vivid, rich, full of nuance I had never noticed before. The subtle variations in stillness, the textures of absence, the way different rooms held different kinds of quiet, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid of it. And that realization horrified me because fear is a warning, and the absence of fear meant acceptance, and acceptance meant transformation. And as I stood there in the muted living room, The silence leaned in not to threaten but to instruct, showing me how to listen without ears, how to sense the weight of unspoken thoughts, how to feel the presence of people who weren't there yet. And I knew, with a certainty that felt like destiny, that my role was no longer to speak into the silence, but to wait within it, to become the thing that answers when someone else eventually makes the same mistake I once did. The first time I sensed another presence in the house, it wasn't through sound but through disturbance, a subtle ripple in the silence, like a breath taken somewhere far away. And I knew instantly that someone had entered, not because I heard the door open, but because the quiet shifted to accommodate them, stretching, reshaping. And as I stood motionless in the living room, I felt a pull toward the hallway, the same pull that had guided me before, except this time it wasn't coercive. It was expectant. And a wave of dread washed over me as understanding settled in, because I wasn't being summoned as a victim anymore. I was being positioned as part of the house's response, and when I moved, my steps left no trace of sound, my presence sliding through rooms like a thought rather than a body. And from the shadows near the entrance, I felt the newcomer's unease bloom, the sharp edge of human discomfort with unnatural quiet. And I recognized it instantly, because it mirrored what I had felt when I first arrived. And as they stepped further inside, their nervous energy disrupted the silence in small, clumsy ways. A jacket brushing against the wall, a foot scuffing the floor, the faint hitch in their breathing, and the silence reacted by tightening slightly, testing, just as it had with me. And I realized with a sickening clarity that the house was repeating a pattern, one refined over countless iterations, and that my role now was not to interfere, but to listen, to observe, to understand how the silence chose its next voice. And when the newcomer spoke, a casual remark tossed into the dark to break the tension, the silence responded, and I felt it through my bones. The familiar vibration of acknowledgement and panic surged in them instantly, sharp and electric, and I could sense their thoughts scattering, their mind grasping for explanations. And the silence fed on that confusion, deepening its hold. And as I watched from the threshold, invisible and unheard, a horrifying realization dawned on me. I wasn't witnessing a haunting. I was participating in an inheritance, one passed from voice to voice, silence to silence. And the house wasn't cruel. It was patient, and patience made it unstoppable. And as the newcomer hesitated, torn between fear and denial, the silence leaned toward me, not to command, but to invite. And I felt a choice forming, subtle but absolute, because I could stay silent and let the house speak as it always had, or I could do what had been done to me, shape the response, guide the fear, become the thing that answers. And as the newcomer whispered into the quiet again, their voice trembling, I understood that whatever I did next would decide whether I remained human or completed the transformation the silence had begun. The moment I realized I could speak again, truly speak, not as a person trapped in fear, but as something shaped by the silence itself, a calm settled over me that felt deeply wrong, because it wasn't relief, it was alignment. And as the newcomer stood in the living room, frozen by the house's unnatural quiet, I felt the silence gather around me, not to suppress my voice, but to carry it, to stretch it beyond sound. And when I finally answered their whisper, I didn't use words at first. I let intention flow outward, letting the silence shape it into something they could perceive. And I watched their posture change instantly, their shoulders tensing, their breathing hitching as realization crept in that they were no longer alone. And I felt a strange echo of myself in their fear, a memory of who I used to be. And for a fleeting moment I hesitated, because understanding creates the illusion of choice. But the silence pressed gently, reminding me that this wasn't about cruelty, it was about continuation. And when I finally spoke aloud, the sound didn't originate from my mouth. It came from everywhere at once, layered, patient, and intimate. And the newcomer recoiled as the house itself seemed to answer them. And I sensed their thoughts racing, the desperate mental calculations, the instinct to deny. And the silence responded by tightening, just enough to guide them toward the hallway. And as they moved, Driven by fear and curiosity, I moved with them, unseen, feeling the structure of the house shift in anticipation, preparing the same path it had prepared for me. And with each step they took, the silence deepened, adjusting its pressure to match their resistance. And I realized then that my role was not to replace the presence behind the chair, but to refine the process, to ensure the transition was smooth, efficient, and complete. And as the newcomer reached the door at the end of the hallway, the same door marked by silent desperation, I felt the last remnants of my humanity stir, urging me to stop, to warn them. But warning required sound, and sound belonged to the silence now. And when the door opened and the soundless room revealed itself, I understood the final truth. I had not been chosen at random. I had been shaped into something necessary, a voice that could guide others into quiet without breaking them. And as the newcomer stepped inside, their fear peaking, the silence leaned toward me again, waiting. And for the first time since this began, it asked, not in words, but in expectation, what kind of answer I would become. I don't remember when the newcomer stopped resisting, only the moment the silence settled around them the way it once settled around me. Not violently, not suddenly, but with a calm that felt earned. And as they sat in the chair facing the wall, breathing shallow, their thoughts loud and desperate, I felt the house relax, satisfied. And in that moment, I understood that the cycle didn't end with transformation. It ended with replacement. Because silence, no matter how vast, always seeks balance. And I felt the presence that had claimed me for so long begin to withdraw. Not leaving, but receding, folding itself deeper into the structure of the house, into the walls, the floor, the spaces between rooms. And as it did, something shifted inside me. A loosening, a quiet release. And for the first time since I had spoken into the silence, I felt the faint echo of individuality return. Not enough to escape, but enough to remember what it meant to choose. And I realized then that the silence didn't want obedience forever. It wanted continuity, and that continuity required a voice willing to listen before it answered. And as the newcomer's fear softened into acceptance, the silence turned its attention away from me completely, focusing on shaping them instead, teaching them the same rules, the same patterns, the same terrible understanding. And I felt myself fade from the center of the house, becoming less defined, less necessary, until I was nothing more than another quiet space within the structure, another absence among many. And when the front door finally opened days later, when sunlight spilled in and the outside world returned like a distant memory, it wasn't me who stepped out. It was the newcomer, moving carefully, speaking softly, already learning the weight of sound. And as they crossed the threshold, the house grew still again, patient once more, waiting. And now, as I exist here in the quiet between words, in the pause before sound, you should understand something, because this is the truth I never realized until it was too late. Silence is never empty. It remembers every voice that enters it. It learns them. It keeps them. And if you've ever whispered into the dark and felt something listen, if you've ever spoken when you thought no one was there and sensed the quiet lean closer, then it's already heard you too. And one day, when you speak into the silence again, don't be surprised if something finally decides to speak back. If you've ever whispered into the dark and felt the quiet lean closer, remember this. Silence is never empty, and one day, it might answer back.